Hi everyone, my name is Emily Fundora. I'm going to be presenting the topic of men as victims of sex trafficking. Human trafficking, according to United Nations, is known as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, and harboring of people, mainly by threats or use of force or other forms of deception, basically to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Trafficking has become one of the most prominent crimes affecting many populations worldwide. In this presentation, I plan to relay accurate information regarding the details about men as victims of human sex trafficking. Although human trafficking can be heavily linked to sex trafficking, it is believed that women are the sole victims of sex trafficking, but that's not exactly the case. Even though most of the victims of trafficking are composed of women and children, men may also be subject to the evils of this crime. Basically, men as victims of human trafficking are usually the most overlooked. Statistically, women make up about 95 or 98% of victims of trafficking, and males make up the remaining 2%. Just because the male population takes up such a seemingly low percentage does not mean that their victimization is meaningless, which we will clarify further in this presentation. For some history, in order to introduce how human trafficking of males has evolved, there are several instances throughout time that outline the beginnings of trafficking and sex trafficking as a form of business around the world. For example, the African slave trade, which was comprised of an abundance of victims from Africa, was a lengthy and torturous form of slavery that spread across the globe. Although the slave trade may have originated in different time periods, depending on the regions that took part in it, many African men were subject to slavery once the Portuguese settlers scoped the African coast in search of gold around the early 1400s. While the collection of gold was the primary goal, settlers around the world believed that they could establish a monopolizing business of sorts of selling African inhabitants as slaves to other regions. In this way, settlers could make monetary rewards off of enslaving Africans. Altogether, approximately 81,000 Africans were traded to Europe and even more so to other continents over time. About roughly 4.5 million Africans were transported in total, highlighting the influence of desire for money and power of these settlers. These events were the building blocks of modern-day human trafficking, depriving victims of their rights for freedom, and continues to be an ongoing practice as time moves on. In the year 1807, the region of Britain abolished slavery, and the United States followed suit later in the 1800s around the Civil War era. Despite the outlawed practices of slavery, white slavery became the contemporary form of slavery soon after. Once white slavery was brought to light as a widespread issue around the world, the first international agreement on human trafficking was signed in 1904, and it was known as the International Agreement for Suppression of White Slave Traffic. The goal of this agreement was to obliterate the selling of trafficking of individuals as slaves entirely. With further implications and improvements came the signing of the International Convention for the Suppression of White Slaves Trade, which officially outlawed white slavery in 1910. Moreover, World War I was also a crucial stepping stone in the acknowledgement of human trafficking once the League of Nations was established as an official organization. The Allied powers of war emphasized the international trafficking of women and children, both male and female, that had become a huge problem during the war. To combat these issues, the International Convention for the Suppression of Traffic in Women and Children was passed in the year 1921 by 33 countries in the League of Nations. Once the World War II came about, crimes known as organ harvesting and labor trafficking were festering. The United Nations came together to apply the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. This was known as the first agreement to acknowledge modern-day slavery, and it particularly highlighted the possibility of men as victims of human trafficking. According to statistical evidence, there are about roughly 510 known trafficking streams existing worldwide. In the year 2007, it was estimated that about 32% of trafficking victims were forced labor migrants. In 2013, the percentage increased to 40%. Many of these forced labor victims are men. Consequently, trafficking in women is decreasing, outlining the prospect of men as more prominent victims of trafficking. On the other hand, there are many anecdotes and memoirs published about the experiences women have had as victims of sex trafficking, yet I have found information about a man named Jerome Alam, who was a male victim of domestic sex trafficking as a child, but in his early adult years since childhood. Since becoming free of his enslavement, Alam has written a novel and published many articles about his experiences and how he hopes his victimization can serve as an eye-opening story for others. To summarize Alam's journey, I have inserted a few excerpts from his article briefly telling his experiences firsthand. And I quote, For 7 long years, I was trapped in a hell no one deserves. I was nothing more than a shell of a human being enduring suffering and torture at the hands of psychopaths and sociopaths as the world looked on. I attended school and from the outside appeared to be a normal child, but I was being trafficked in plain sight. I was often pulled out of school to service clients, and after school, holidays and weekends were all just a never-ending nightmare for me. My escape from the world of human trafficking came at a high cost. I had tried to tell at least 10 people that I was being trafficked, and my reward for this was, among other things, having 3 of my ribs broken. My life had become an abyss of worthlessness and pain, and at the age of 12, I stood in my mother's rose garden, a bottle of sleeping pills in one hand and a bottle of vodka in the other. As the agents of my demise tumbled down my throat, chased by the warmth of the vodka, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I felt a peace I had never felt before. I had finally escaped the nightmare, and I was no longer afraid. Suddenly, I awoke in the emergency room to a group of wide-eyed doctors who had witnessed me depart from this world for a total of 3 minutes. God, it seems, had other plans for me, and I was finally freed from my nightmare as the horrified doctors noticed a bruise that formed a tapestry across my body, chronicling the abuse I suffered. I sincerely believe it is the it is through God's intervention that I am here today as a survivor of human trafficking and not a casualty. I stand here today not only as a survivor, but as a living testament that there's always hope and light inside all of us that no one can extinguish. In short, Elam's story is unique in his persistence to bring awareness to men as victims of human trafficking, either as children or as adults. His belief in faith and determination has landed him in an influential position that can help prevent and recover the suffering of victims of sex trafficking. Based on the topic of men as victims of trafficking, it is interesting to note that about 10 to 15% of reported sex trafficking victims are males. Males in sex trafficking are mostly reported in regions of Asia and the Middle East, where these crimes are prevalent. One study by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice found that of the individuals sexually exploited in New York, about 50% of the victims were males from the U.S., being trafficked domestically like Jerome Alam. Due to the commonness of men in trafficking, many recovery services provided for males involve treatment for HIV and AIDS. Additionally, aside from sex trafficking, many male victims are used as forced laborers working in fields as fishers or in manufacturing business under harsh working conditions. Finally, I have the reference page, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for watching.